feel like we're living between two worlds. I feel like we're coming out of something that we have never seen before, and we're moving into a world that we cannot predict. The experiences that we've had in the last year, 15 months, 20 months, are hard to grasp. Even looking back on the early days of the pandemic, it's hard to believe that we went through all that we went through. And now as we move into the summer, it only reminds us of what last summer was like and how much things have changed in a year. It's hard to get your hands on everything that's occurred in the last year. And yet, as we emerge out of the pandemic and head into a new world, I think most of us realize that the world's not just going to snap back into its old ways, that somehow the world we're moving into is going to be transformed by what everybody has been through in the last 15 to 20 months. One article recently in The Atlantic said this. They were talking about the economics, but I think it applies to almost everything that we're facing. It says, making predictions is hard, not only because the future is hard to see, but because the present is hard to grasp. The future is hard to see, but the present is hard to grasp. And as we move into this new world, I think the only thing that we can be sure of is the person that we are going to bring into that new world. Who are we going to be as we cross over into a very unknown future? Because we're living in this time between two worlds, we're going to be starting a new series. It's from the 5th book in the Bible, and it has a message for us about moving into the promised land. The book is called Deuteronomy, and it has a message for us today. We're going to look at the first 3 chapters this morning, and in the very first words of Deuteronomy chapter 1, you get the whole setting. Let me read it, and then I'll explain what it has to say to us today. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1 says this: "These are the words Moses spoke to all Israel in the wilderness east of the Jordan, that is in the Arabah, opposite Zuph, between Paran and Tophel, Laban Hazeroth, and Dizhabab. It takes 11 days to go from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea by the Mount Seir road." Verse 3 says this: "In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses proclaimed to the Israelites all that the Lord had commanded him concerning them. This was after he had defeated Sihon, king of the Amorites, who reigned in Heshbon, and Edrei had defeated Og, king of Bashan, who reigned in Ashtaroth." Now, sorting between all those place names, here's what those first words of the book of Deuteronomy are saying to you and I. Moses says that he's in these places. He's in Zuph. He is in Hazeroth. And then he says it takes 11 days to get from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea. And then it says, in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses proclaimed to the Israelites all that God had laid on his heart. So these are Moses' words to a group of people. All those place names, although they're hard to place after all this time, really put Moses on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Why that's significant to you and I is that Moses is talking to a group of people who are about to cross the river into the promised land. They are about to leave the wilderness and go into the promised land. They are a people living between two worlds. The entire book of Deuteronomy is what Moses is telling the people, what he thinks they absolutely need to know before they move into a future that they cannot see, as they put the wilderness behind them and move into the new world that they cannot see. Does that sound like something relevant to us? As we are coming out of the wilderness of the last 15, 18, 20 months, moving into a world that we cannot see. Now, embedded in the words that we just said, you might not have picked it up, but there's this little verse that says, it takes 11 days to get from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea. Horeb is a general term that means the mountains where Moses got the 10 Commandments. So to put it in its context, Moses leads the Jewish people out of Egypt, across the Red Sea, into the wilderness. God does a miraculous work and frees them from the army of Egypt. He leads them into the wilderness. He provides for them. He gives them quail, and he gives them manna, and he provides for all of them, and he leads them to Mount Sinai, where they receive the Ten Commandments and all of the law. If you remember, we studied all of that last year when we looked at the book of Exodus. So it takes 11 days to get from that mountain where they received the Ten Commandments to the edge of the promised land. But it also says in verse 3, in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month. And so it only takes 11 days to get from where you got the Ten Commandments to the land of the promised land, and yet it has actually taken 40 years. I was trying to get my head around this. I was thinking to myself, imagine that you're talking to an older gentleman and you're talking about fathers and sons. And he says to you, I had a lot of secrets that I needed to share with my son. And I told him that when he graduates high school, I'm going to tell him all that he needs to know about our family. It takes about 10 minutes to get from our high school to my kitchen table. But I told him all those secrets 40 years later. Now, if that was how your conversation began with this older gentleman, you'd say to yourself, wow, there's a story there. You could have told him 10 minutes after he graduated, and yet you waited 40 years. And in the same way, Moses could have been having this conversation with the people 11 days after they got the Ten Commandments, and yet it happened 40 years earlier. Why is that? And that makes up the substance of chapter 1 and 2 of Deuteronomy. Moses recounts the failure of the people to enter the promised land the first time they were given the opportunity. Basically, it says this. Verse 6 says this. The Lord our God said to us at Horeb, you have stayed long enough on this mountain. Break camp and advance to the hill country of the Amorites. Go to all the neighboring peoples in the Arabah, in the mountains, in the western foothills, in the Negev, and along the coast, to the land of the Canaanites, and to the Lebanon, as far as the great river, the Euphrates. See, I have given you this land. Go and take possession of the land. The land the Lord swore that he would give to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to the descendants after them. And then after he says that, there's this little period where he talks about how he organized all of them into different groups. And he says in verse 8, at that time I said to you, you are too heavy a burden for me to carry alone. The Lord your God has increased your numbers today so that you are as numerous as the stars in the sky. So Moses takes them back and he says, if you remember 40 years ago, we left Horeb and God said, go advance to the promised land. And he had made our numbers as numerous as the stars in the sky. We had become a whole people. We had been at Sinai for a couple of years, and it was time, he said, long enough, time to move into the promised land and take this land that I am giving you. And so they do. They head off into the promised land. But before they do, they get this idea. It says, in verse 19, he says, then, as the Lord our God commanded us, we sent out from Horeb and went toward the hill country of the Amorites through all the vast and dreadful wilderness that you have seen, so we reached Kadesh Barnea. Then, skipping down to verse 22, it says, then all of you came to me and said, let us send men ahead to spy out the land for us. So Moses said, good idea. He took one man from each tribe, and he sent them as a reconnaissance party into the promised land. The idea was find out where people are, find out what you can about the land, come back, and then we will enter into this promised land that God is giving us. And then in verse 26, Moses recounts the big failure of the people. He says this, but you were unwilling to go up. You rebelled against the command of the Lord your God. You grumbled in your tents and said, the Lord hates us, So he brought us out of Egypt to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us. Where can we go? So when the people heard that there were already people living in the promised land and that these people seemed to be very big and very strong, they got scared. And instead of advancing forward and taking hold of the promise that God had for them, they shrank back. And they would not trust God enough to enter the promised land. And Moses begged them, look, don't worry about the people. God is on our side. And if God is on our side, and if this is what God is telling us to do, then he's going to take care of all of that. He says in verse 29, then I said to you, do not be terrified. Do not be afraid. The Lord your God, who is going before you, will fight for you as he did in Egypt before your very eyes and in the wilderness. He said, you saw how God led us out of Egypt. They were stronger than we were. Trust God. He'll lead you into the promised land. In verse 32, he says, in spite of this, you did not trust in the Lord your God. You did not trust in the Lord your God. And so as a consequence, in verse 34, when the Lord heard what you said, he was angry and solemnly swore, no one from this evil generation shall see the good land I swore to give to your ancestors, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh. He will see it, and I will give him and his descendants the land that he set his feet on, because he followed the Lord wholeheartedly. This is why, even though it takes 11 days to get from the mountain where they got the 10 Commandments to the edge of the promised land, it took them 40 years to begin to enter the promised land. Because the first generation that was given the opportunity did not trust God enough to take a hold of that opportunity. They fell victim to their fears and their worries, and they started to question God, and they could not question that God was good. They would not trust him, and they rebelled. And as a result, God said, this generation does not go into the promised land, and they wandered around the promised land for 40 years. Here's what I think this is saying to us. You and I are about to enter a whole new land. We're going to enter a whole new world, a post-pandemic America world. We don't know what's awaiting us. But we can look back and we can say, okay, where did I fail during the time of the pandemic? What were my failures? All of us failed. All of us fell short of the glory of God. All of us struggled with being faithful. All of us struggled with loving our neighbors. All of us struggled with being kind to the people around us. The stress on us was enormous. The situations were perplexed. The country was deeply divided. And all of us failed at some point. And before we head off into the promised land, I think it's worth looking back and saying, what happened during the pandemic that I'm not happy about? How did I respond in ways that I wish I didn't? What can I learn from my failures? Before Moses took the next generation into the promised land, he made them go back and he recounted their failures. And he said, look, this is how you responded in the past. Don't do this. And the only way to really make sure you don't do it is to bring it up again, to see it, to own it, to repent of it, and then to leave it in the wasteland. We want to remember our failures, those places where we acted out of fear, where we acted out of anger, where we acted out of malice, where we maybe just could not, no matter what, seem to trust God and find any peace. We want to take the failures, we want to remember them, we want to offer them to God, and we say, God, I don't want to bring this into the next world. I want to leave this behind. You've convicted me, you've told me these are things I want to grasp your forgiveness through Jesus Christ, and I want to leave this in the past. How have you failed? And are you willing to leave that in the wilderness as you head forward? Well, he continues on. And as he gets to chapter 2, there's this funny little verse. It says this. Then the Lord said to me, you have made your way around this hill country long enough. Oh, wait, let me read chapter 2, verse 1. It says this, for chapter 2, verse 1. Then we turned back and set out toward the wilderness along the route of the Red Sea. as the Lord had directed me. For a long time, we made our way around the hill country of Seir. For a long time, we made our way around the hill country of Seir. Moses is saying, and so therefore, we didn't go to the promised land. We wandered around the wilderness for a long time. The similarity between them and us is that that time of wilderness wandering went on a lot longer than they ever thought it would. It's not hard to remember back to the early days of the pandemic when we said, well, we'll just close for a couple of months, or we'll just work from home until the end of March. And everything went on longer than we thought. And of course, it's still not over around the world. But we are clearly entering a new land. But one of the things that we recognize is that it all went on much longer than we thought. And that's what happened to Moses. So in chapter 2, he says, we wandered around. But eventually, they came to verse 2. And it says this, then the Lord said to me, you have made your way around this hill country long enough. Now turn north. Give the people these orders. You are about to pass through the territory of your relatives, the descendants of Esau, who live in Seir. They will be afraid of you, but be very careful. Do not provoke them to war. He said, long enough. You've been in the wilderness long enough. Turn north. Now it's time to go back to the edge of the promised land. Now it's go back and inherit that promise. And he even brings them down, and he says in verse 7, Moses says these words to him, the Lord your God has blessed you in all the work of your hands. He has watched over your journey through this vast wilderness. These 40 years, the Lord your God has been with you, and you have not lacked anything. Moses says to them, look, you were all disobedient, and that's why the nation wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. But let's remember another side of this. God was faithful. He brought you through the wilderness. He says to them, the Lord blessed you, and he watched over your journey, and he made sure that you didn't lack anyone, anything. And this is the heart of the gospel, that our recognizing that we've fallen short and failed is not the end of our story. In fact, as Christians, it's the beginning of our story. Us realizing that we have failed is just a step toward reconciling with God. That's what the gospel is all about. You know, the scriptures say that all of us have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, that all of us have turned wrong, that we've all done misdeeds. But God loved us so much that he pursued us, and he entered our world in the person of Jesus. And he atoned for our sins by giving his life. And what that means is that for Christians, admitting our failure is just the first step to confessing that to God, accepting his forgiveness, and starting over again. It's not an overstatement to say that for followers of Jesus, every day is a chance to start over again. And so how much more this time between two worlds that we're faced with now? We are entering a new world, but for us as Christians, it's a time to say, what do I want to leave in the wilderness? God is leading me to a new place, and God has been faithful. The heart of the good news, what we call the gospel, is that God is infinitely more faithful to us than we are to him. That's okay. We get used to it. We fail, but God is always there. He carries us. He leads us through. When we give our lives to God through Jesus Christ, we become his children, and he never rejects us. He stays with us. He is faithful to us, and he will carry us through the valley of the shadow of death, and he will lead us into these new worlds. And so he says, God has been with you. And so as we move into this new time, we want to remember how we failed, but we also want to remember how God has been faithful. How has God been faithful to you in these 20 months? What can you say? How can you hold on to that? That was important because Moses was saying it's that faithfulness that you rest on as you enter this new world. And so in this starting over again, God then gave this whole new generation of people another chance to be obedient to him. He gave them another opportunity. He says to them, you're now going to head north. You're going back to the promised land. I'm going to take you to the edge of the promised land. And he says, you're going to go through some territory that's owned by other people. And these people, though you may not realize it, are distant relatives of yours. The land of Moab and the land of the Ammonites. And he says, you are not to harass them. In chapter 2, verse 9, he says, then the Lord said to me, do not harass the Moabites or provoke them to war. I will not give you any part of their land. I have given Ar to the descendants of Lot as a possession. And skipping down to verse 16, he says, now you are the last of these fighting men among the people that had died. The Lord said to me, today you are to pass by the region of Moab and Ar. When you come to the Ammonites, do not harass them or provoke them to war, for I will not give you possessions of any land belonging to the Ammonites. I have given it as a possession to the descendants of Lot. And then there's a whole bunch of other material in that chapter about what was going on in that land. And it's relevant to us for two ways. One, in giving the people a chance to start over again, he gives them clear direction and he gives them another opportunity to obey. Starting over again is another chance to reconcile to God and a chance to change your path and to begin to obey what God is calling you to. God says to the people, look, you're going to pass through this land and you're not to provoke these people. You are not to go to war with them. You are not to take any of their land. This is not the land I'm giving you. Why? Because I've given it to these other people. I'm bringing you to a different place. That's not your destiny. So the main thing is starting over again gives them a new chance to obey. The other thing that's interesting to us, just from a theological standpoint, is as we move into Deuteronomy, and as you follow the history of the Jewish people, they enter the promised land and they kick out and defeat everybody who's there. And it feels very arbitrary in a sense. It feels like God is just saying, well, I love the Jews and I'm giving them this land and they're to conquer the people who are there. But it's also interesting to note that there were a bunch of other people living in the land that God said, you're not to take their land. And it reminds us that God has dealings with all these people, much of which we don't know anything about. God was sovereign over all of these nations. And these nations, he said, I've given them this land. It used to belong to these people. I've given it to these people. I'm giving you a new land. And the reason I'm giving it to you is because I and my sovereign will own that land, and I'm giving it to you. And the fact that I'm telling you to drive out these people is because that's what they deserve. I have decreed it. But it's not like they could just go in and take whatever they wanted. They had to do exactly what God told them to do. And so then what happens is, as they move through, they offer peace to the various people until they get to these people, Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. Strange names, but the gist of it is this. These people are offered peace as the Israelites pass through, but they refuse to take it. And they come out and they become the aggressors and come across and come against the Jewish people. And God gives them a great victory. It says in chapter 3, verse 1, next we turned and went up along the road toward Bashan, and Og, king of Bashan, and his whole army marched out to meet us in the battle of Edrei. The Lord said to me in verse 2, do not be afraid of him, for I have delivered him into your hands, along with his whole army and his land. Do to him what you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who reigned in Heshbon. And so on the edge of the promised land, God not only tells them, how did you fail? Leave that in the wilderness. How have I been faithful? Hold on to that. But he also reminds that he's given them victories. In the same way, in these last several months, you've not only had failures, but you've also had victories. You've had times where God has shown up, where God has done great good in your life, where God has shown you new things. And he's saying, as you move into this new land, you can trust me. I've not only been faithful, but I've given you victories. And so I ask you, what are the victories that God has given to you? What are the new things that God has done in your life that you want to hold on to? This is the beginning of what God tells the people. He begins to tell them, he says, you are moving into a new world and you are moving into a new land. And the only thing that you need to be sure of is who you are. As you move into this new world, I want you to confirm your identity as my people because I have a plan for you. And so as we cross over from the world of the wilderness of the pandemic and into a new world that we cannot see, I'd encourage you to take the same steps that Moses encouraged the Jews to take. As we move our way through the book of Deuteronomy, we want to start by doing this. Recognize where you have failed and confess that to God. Let's admit that failure and let's leave that in the wilderness. But let's also remember how God has been faithful. It's been tough. It's been a tough time. But hasn't God also been faithful to you and I? Hasn't he also come alongside of us and given us strength to do things that we never thought we could do? And hasn't he also given you a couple of victories? Aren't there some new things that he's shown you, some new ways of trusting him that you want to hold on to? Moses says we can build on those victories and we can trust God to give us new victories, and that's what you and I can do too. We're going to look at our identity as God's people as we move through this book and prepare to move into an unknown world. For today, we're going to leave behind our failures. We're going to hold on to God's faithfulness. We're going to celebrate his victory, and we're going to trust that as we move into this unknown land, God will lead us. Let me pray for all of us. Father, help us to leave our failures. We don't want to forget them because we want to learn from them. But remind us above all of your faithfulness and your victories. And help us to be your people as we move into an uncertain future. In Jesus' name, amen.